It began as nothing more than rain, days of it steady, endless, unremarkable, the kind of rain people in western Pennsylvania had seen 100 times before. In the valley below, the people of Johnstown carried on. Men worked in the mills. Women washed clothes by the river. Children watched the gray sky and waited for it to pass. 20 miles up in the mountains, a private lake was swelling. A lake held back by an aging earthen dam, once a feat of engineering, now a forgotten wall of dirt and stone. It belonged to the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, a retreat for the wealthy men of Pittsburgh. Steel barons, bankers, railroad magnates, few of them ever thought about the town below. By the morning of May 31st, 1889, the rain had turned the valley into a basin. The rivers rose, the air grew heavy, and still, no one truly believed the dam would fail. At 3:10 inches the afternoon, it did. A wall of water 40 feet high, racing faster than a train, tore through the valley. It carried trees, houses, bridges, people, and finally, Johnstown itself. When it was over, more than 2,000 lives were gone. It was the deadliest flood in American history, and yet it began with nothing more than a quiet rain. This is the story of the Johnstown flood, of the people who built the dam, those who lived beneath it, and the silence that followed when the water was gone. In the last decades of the 19th century, western Pennsylvania was a place of ambition. Deep valleys, thick forests, and endless seams of coal fueled the great engines of the American industrial age. Steel mills glowed at night, railroads wound through the mountains, and small towns thrived along the rivers that powered the factories. Johnstown was one of those towns a valley city built, where the Little Conemaugh and Stony Creek rivers meet. It wasn't large, but it was proud. 25,000 people lived there, most of them workers in the Cambria Iron Works, one of the most advanced steel producers in the country. To many, Johnstown symbolized the progress of a new America. Hard work, self-reliance, and prosperity born from the clang of metal and the rhythm of the railroad. The valley itself was beautiful, though narrow and steep. Hills rose sharply on both sides, trapping fog in the mornings and holding the warmth of the mills at night. Houses stood close together along the main streets, their porches lined with laundry and coal dust. The rivers were the lifeblood of the town, bringing power, carrying freight, and at times flooding the lowlands in spring. Flooding was part of life. When the water rose, people moved their things to the second floor and waited. It always went down again. In 1889, few questioned the balance between nature and industry. The railroads had conquered distance, dams had conquered rivers. The people believed in progress, in engineering, in the human ability to control the land, and in that confidence, they built their homes and their futures at the bottom of a valley. Upstream, 20 miles away, high in the Allegheny Mountains, stood an enormous reservoir, Lake Conemaugh. It was once a marvel of the Pennsylvania Canal system, designed to feed water into the channels that carried goods across the state. By the 1882, the canal system was obsolete. Railroads had replaced it. The lake was abandoned, the dam neglected, until a group of wealthy industrialists from Pittsburgh saw an opportunity. They bought the land, repaired the old dam, and turned the mountain lake into their private playground, the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The membership list read like a who's who of the Gilded Age: Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, men who built fortunes in steel and coal. They came to the mountains for escape. Here, among the forests and cool breezes, they could leave behind the smoke of Pittsburgh and enjoy their leisure. The lake glittered in the sun, stocked with trout, and surrounded by cottages built for comfort. To them, it was paradise. Down in Johnstown, it was something else, a distant curiosity. Few townspeople had ever seen the lake. Most didn't care who owned it. The dam had been there for decades, and it had never failed. It was simply part of the landscape, as permanent as the mountains. Yet the town's prosperity was tied to the same industry that had built that dam and filled that lake. Iron, steel, and ambition connected both worlds, the mill workers below and the magnates above. Each believed in progress, though they lived in very different versions of it. The air in Johnstown smelled of coal and wet stone. The mills never truly stopped. Day and night, the hammering and the roar of furnaces echoed through the valley. For those who lived there, the sound was life itself, a promise of steady work and a better future. No one imagined that the same forces of progress, the dam, the industry, the human confidence, would soon turn against them. The valley was built for progress, yes, but it was also built to collect water. Every drop that fell on the surrounding mountains eventually found its way down to Johnstown. In late May of 1889, those drops began to fall harder and faster than anyone could remember, and the valley so perfect for steel and industry would soon become the perfect trap. High above Johnstown, in the folds of the Allegheny Mountains, the South Fork Dam stood like a forgotten relic of an earlier age. It was not a modern structure. It had been built in the 1852, long before Johnstown had become an industrial city. The Pennsylvania Canal Commission had ordered it as part of an ambitious plan to move goods across the state, a vast network of canals, locks, and reservoirs connecting Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. The South Fork Dam was meant to store water for that system, feeding it into the Conemaugh River when levels ran low. For a time, it worked. But progress is a restless thing. By the 1862, the canal system had been replaced by railroads. The dam, once a symbol of engineering pride, was abandoned. Maintenance stopped. The spillways clogged. The water receded, leaving behind a silent basin and a wall of clay and stone exposed to weather and time. For years, the empty reservoir sat quietly in the mountains. The nearby communities grew used to its stillness. Only hunters, farmers, and travelers on horseback passed by the site. The dam seemed harmless, a sleeping giant that no one needed anymore. Then, in the early 1882, change came again. A group of Pittsburgh's most powerful men, bankers, steel magnates, and railroad executives purchased the land. They saw not a derelict dam, but an opportunity. The mountains offered escape from the city, from the smog and the politics and the constant noise of industry. The property became the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, a private retreat for the wealthy elite of the Gilded Age. They ordered the dam repaired, but cheaply. The engineers who inspected it were competent, but the work was rushed. They used local labor and materials on hand: earth, clay, timber, stone. No one took precise measurements. No formal plans were filed. They simply rebuilt what looked like a dam. In the process, the spillway, the overflow that would have released excess water safely, was partially blocked by fish screens. The club wanted to keep their prized trout from escaping. To the men who owned the lake, the idea of a dam failing seemed absurd. It had stood for decades. Surely it would stand for decades more. They also lowered the height of the dam's crest to create a carriage path, a road across the top for easier access to their lodges. Each modification, by itself, seemed minor. Together, they created a structure that could no longer bear the strain of the mountain rains. But in 882nd, Pennsylvania, there were no building codes for dams, no inspections, no accountability. If it looked solid, it was assumed to be safe. The club's members called the reservoir Lake Conemaugh. It stretched more than 2 miles, holding an estimated 20 million tons of water. On calm summer days, it looked serene, a mirror of sky and forest. Visitors described it as a jewel in the hills. They fished, rowed small boats, and dined on the veranda overlooking the water. Few of them ever thought about the dam itself. From their cottages, they could not see Johnstown, 20 miles downstream, but if they had followed the line of the river with their eyes, they would have seen a narrow valley filled with houses, mills, railroads, and people. They might have noticed how the valley floor sloped gently, how water, if released, would have nowhere to go but forward. In those years, it rained often in the Alleghenies. The soil was thin, the rivers quick to rise. But the dam had held before, and the men of the club trusted their luck, their wealth, and their status. They were used to things working out in their favor. As spring of 1889 approached, the lake filled to its brim. The fishermen admired the high water. The caretakers took note but did little. It had become routine, the same rains, the same season. Nothing had changed, except for the dam itself. Beneath its surface, cracks had begun to appear, tiny fractures in the clay core, invisible from above. The earth was saturated, the pressure rising. The same structure that once symbolized the triumph of progress was now quietly decaying under its own weight. In Johnstown, life went on as usual. The factories roared, the trains passed, and the sound of hammers echoed through the valley. No one looked up at the mountains and imagined what 20 million tons of water could do. But in the hills, behind an old dam built for a forgotten purpose, time was running out. The South Fork Dam was never built to last forever. It was a simple earthen structure, clay and rock, packed by hand, sealed with a thin core of puddled earth. No concrete, no steel, no modern drainage system. In its original form, it worked because it was cared for, inspected, maintained, and kept within safe limits. But by the time the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club took ownership, the dam had already been through decades of neglect. When repairs began in the early 1882nd, they were meant to be temporary. The lake only needed to look good, not function perfectly. Workers filled cracks with mud and straw. They replaced the outlet pipes with wooden plugs instead of valves because the old iron fittings were missing and expensive to replace. Once the plugs were sealed, the dam could no longer be drained. The lake, from that point on, would always remain full. The engineers who visited the site after the repairs were uneasy. One of them, William Francis, a civil engineer from the Pennsylvania Railroad, noted that the dam's crest was dangerously low. He warned that in heavy rains, water could rise and spill over the top, an event no earthen dam could survive. His report was ignored. The club saw no reason to spend money on changes. Other local observers expressed concern about the blocked spillway. It was a narrow stone channel that allowed excess water to escape safely down the slope. But the club had covered it with screens to keep fish from escaping. During storms, debris from the hills often clogged the openings, forcing water to rise higher and higher behind the dam. Still, nothing happened. The dam held year after year. The lake shimmered, the trout thrived, and the wealthy members returned each summer to fish, dine, and boast about the beauty of their mountain refuge. The caretakers who lived there year-round occasionally patched cracks or reinforced the outer wall with dirt and logs. They had no instruments to measure pressure or seepage. Their inspections were made with their eyes and their faith. Meanwhile, below in the valley, No one had authority to question the safety of a private dam. There were no state regulations, no engineers assigned to review it. Even if someone had tried to intervene, the owners of the club were among the most powerful men in Pennsylvania. It was easier to trust that they knew what they were doing. The irony was that the very things that made the dam picturesque, the lowered crest, the fish screens, the calm surface of the lake, were precisely what made it unstable. Aesthetics and convenience had replaced engineering. Every alteration was a small compromise, invisible on its own, but together they formed a chain of weakness. By the spring of 1889, the signs of strain were there for anyone who looked closely. Seepage appeared near the base, tiny trickles of water forming dark streaks through the earth. The spillway was partly blocked by branches and silt. The caretakers sent a few telegrams to Pittsburgh, warning that the dam should be watched. They received no reply. Up at the club, the members talked about fishing and the late snowmelt. Down in Johnstown, families planted gardens and repaired porches for summer. No one saw danger in the hills. The dam was part of the background, large, silent, and familiar. But an earthen wall like that is not solid stone. It moves, it breathes, it weakens from within. Every rainfall added weight to the lake. Every passing year deepened the cracks. What held it together was not design or maintenance, but luck. Luck, as it turned out, was almost gone. By May of 1889, the rains had begun again, heavier than anyone could remember. The caretakers at the lake watched the water rise, inch by inch. The color of the lake darkened, the wind picked up, and the soft earth beneath their boots began to tremble ever so slightly. The dam had withstood decades of storms, but this time it would face more water, more pressure, and less strength than ever before. In the valley below, 20,000 people went to sleep listening to the rain, unaware that the mountain above them was already beginning to shift. Johnstown in 1889 was a working city, built on effort and routine. It sat deep in a narrow valley, hemmed in by steep green hills that seemed to rise straight out of the rooftops. Railroad tracks cut through the town like veins, carrying coal in and steel out. The clang of the mills echoed from morning until night, the heartbeat of the valley. Most families lived in small wooden houses clustered along the riverbanks. There were neat porches, fenced gardens, and lines of laundry that never quite dried in the damp air. Men worked long shifts at the Cambria Iron Works 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. Women kept homes running, tended gardens, and raised children in the shadow of the furnaces. Sundays were for church, dinner, and rest. Life was hard but steady, predictable in its rhythm. The town was proud of that rhythm. It meant stability, something rare in the industrial age. When the whistle from the mill sounded, people knew exactly what time it was. Trains arrived and departed on schedule. Shops opened and closed with the light. The rain came and went. Everything, it seemed, was under control. Floods were part of the town's memory. Over the years, high water had come and gone, leaving mud and inconvenience but little else. The people had learned to live with it. They raised furniture to the second floor, moved livestock to higher ground, and waited. When the water fell again, they cleaned, rebuilt, and went back to work. It was an accepted risk, part of the cost of living near rivers that powered the mills. Above them, 20 miles away, Lake Conemaugh filled the old mountain basin, invisible behind the hills. Most people in Johnstown had never seen it. They heard stories about the wealthy club up there, the grand cottages, the private lake stocked with fish. Some joked about it, others resented it, but few gave it serious thought. The dam had stood since before most of them were born. Why would it fail now? Spring of 1889 had come late. The snows melted quickly, feeding the streams. Then came the rain, not violent, just constant. By the end of May, the rivers in town were already brown and restless. Children floated bits of wood along the current. Men measured the water against the bridge pilings and shrugged. It was nothing they hadn't seen before. The town's streets were alive with the smell of wet earth and coal smoke. Blacksmiths worked under open sheds. The sound of hammers echoed through the drizzle. Street vendors sold vegetables under umbrellas, their carts covered with canvas sheets. Inside houses, lamps glowed behind fogged windows, and the rhythmic tapping of rain on the roof blended with the hum of distant machinery. It was a scene of quiet endurance, the kind that defines working towns. People talked about the rain, about the sluggish trains and flooded basements. They complained, but without fear. Nature was part of life in the valley. It gave and it took, and the people adapted. No one imagined that far above them, the same rain was pushing against a wall of earth that had not been tested in 40 years. That Thursday night, May 30th, the rain intensified. The sky never fully darkened, just thickened into a gray sheet that seemed to hang above the rooftops. The rivers merged, and the current began to tug at fences and logs. Still, the mills worked through the night. The whistle blew at shift change, as it always did. Some men joked about building an ark. Others went home soaked to the bone, warmed by the promise of sleep. In the early hours of May 31st, the rain continued steady, relentless, but not alarming. The townspeople of Johnstown woke, ate breakfast, and prepared for another day. They didn't know that up in the mountains, the caretakers of the dam had been awake all night, watching the water rise to the crest. They didn't know that the dam was already leaking, or that the lake above them was about to become a weapon. For now, it was just rain ordinary, persistent and familiar. The people of Johnstown carried on, unaware that by the end of the day, most of their town would no longer exist. The rain began quietly. It was the kind of rain people welcomed in late spring, soft at first, cleansing the air after weeks of dust from the mills. On the morning of May 30th, 1889, gray clouds rolled over the Allegheny Mountains, and by noon, the drizzle had become a steady downpour. Few thought much of it. Rain was common here, a familiar rhythm that filled the rivers and darkened the hillsides to deep green. By afternoon, the wind picked up. Thin streams of water began to run down the hills, carving small rivulets into the earth. Farmers along the upper valleys of the Little Conemaugh watched the creeks rise against their fences. At the South Fork Dam, caretakers Elias Unger and John Park took turns checking the water line. They had been through heavy rains before, but never quite like this. Through Thursday night, the storm settled over western Pennsylvania and refused to move. Cold air from the north met warm air from the south, trapping the system over the mountains. Rain fell in sheets thick, constant, unbroken. By midnight, the water in Lake Conemaugh was lapping dangerously close to the top of the dam. Down in Johnstown, the storm was just another inconvenience. Families stayed indoors, the streets nearly empty except for the occasional wagon struggling through the mud. The Conemaugh and Stony Creek rivers had begun to merge into one, spreading over the low-lying neighborhoods near the riverbanks. People watched from their windows as barrels and logs drifted past in the current. Still, most went to bed, assuming that by morning the waters would begin to fall. Up at the lake, things were different. The men responsible for the dam, Unger, and Park could hear the groaning of the spillway. The screens that had been placed to keep fish from escaping were now catching branches, leaves, and entire tree limbs. The water that should have flowed harmlessly out of the reservoir had nowhere to go. It was rising fast, several inches every hour. By dawn on May 31st, the rain had not stopped for 36 hours. The dam's crest, already lowered years before to allow a carriage path, was now barely a foot above the lake's surface. The men tried to clear the spillway, but the force of the water was too strong. The current tore at their tools and nearly swept them away. They telegraphed warnings down the line to the South Fork Station and to the Pennsylvania Railroad offices in Johnstown, but messages were delayed or dismissed. Flood warnings were nothing new in the valley. At 7 a.m., the lake was still rising. Elias Unger gathered workers from nearby farms to help dig a new channel around the dam, a desperate attempt to relieve the pressure. They worked in the rain, shoveling through mud and clay. Every minute, the sound of rushing water grew louder, deeper, more menacing. One man later said it was like listening to the heartbeat of something alive. Meanwhile, in Johnstown, morning came gray and heavy. Rain hammered against tin roofs. Telegraph lines crackled with brief reports of flooding up the valley. At the Cambria Iron Works, workers arrived to find the lower yards already underwater. They shrugged, rolled up their trousers, and went to work. It had happened before. The rivers would rise, maybe flood the streets, and then recede. That was how it always went. By 9 a.m., water in Lake Conemaugh was spilling over the top of the dam, a thin, smooth sheet, at first then thicker, louder, carrying debris. Once water begins to pour over an earthen dam, the end is only a matter of time. But down in the valley, no one knew that. The only warning that reached Johnstown that morning was a single telegram. South Fork Dam is liable to break. Notify the people of Johnstown to prepare for the worst. It was sent at 10 a.m., but the lines were unreliable, the rain interfering with the signal. The message arrived too late, and even when it did, few believed it. The dam had always held before. By noon, the rain had become a roar. Up at the lake, men stood helpless on the dam's crest, watching as water cascaded over the edge, tearing at the earth below. The ground shuddered under their feet. Down in Johnstown, church bells rang through the storm, not in warning, but for the funeral of a local resident who had died 2 days earlier. In a few hours, the bells would be silent, and the town that rang them would be gone. By late morning on May 31st, 1889, the South Fork Dam was no longer a wall, it was a wound. Water was pouring over its crest, cutting small channels through the soft earth. Each minute, those channels deepened. The pressure behind the dam was immense. 20 million tons of water pressing against a barrier that had already begun to melt under the rain. Elias Unger, the president of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, stood at the top of the dam, soaked to the bone. He had been awake for more than 30 hours. Beside him, engineer John Parkey and a handful of workers struggled with shovels and picks. They tried to build a second spillway to divert some of the water, but the ground was too saturated. Every shovelful collapsed back into the trench. The rain made it almost impossible to see. They could hear the sound of the lake, now a deep, rolling growl, like thunder that never stopped. Logs, branches, and debris spun in the current near the dam's face. The air smelled of wet earth and rotting wood. Some of the men shouted over the noise, but their words were lost in the wind. Unger knew the truth before anyone said it aloud. The dam could not hold much longer. At about 11:30 a.m., they noticed something new. The water pouring over the crest wasn't just running, it was tearing. Chunks of clay and gravel began to break away, disappearing into the torrent below. The men grabbed whatever they could, fence posts, straw, even mattresses from nearby cottages, and threw them into the gap in a desperate attempt to slow the erosion. Nothing worked. The force of the water was unstoppable. Parquet left briefly to send another telegram down the valley. His message was short. South Fork Dam is bound to go. The water is rising rapidly. This is your last warning. He handed it to a messenger on horseback and returned to the dam. Down in Johnstown, the telegram arrived around noon. Railway operators read it, looked at the rain, and shrugged. Warnings had come before, always false alarms. They placed the message aside, waiting for confirmation. None came. Up at the lake, the situation had become critical. Water was now flowing freely across the entire top of the dam. Every minute, the crest sank lower as the earth eroded away. The spillway was completely blocked. The men could see the dark, swirling whirlpools forming near the center of the dam, a sign that water had begun to tunnel through its core. Once that happens, collapse is inevitable. At 12:30, Unger gave the order to abandon the attempt to save it. He told the workers to move to higher ground. Some refused at first, unwilling to believe the structure could actually fail. They had seen it withstand so many storms before, but when part of the downstream face suddenly slumped away, they ran. The dam was now trembling, alive with sound, a low rumble that came from deep inside the earth. Observers later said it felt like standing next to a freight train. The men on the hillside watched helplessly as the center of the dam began to cave in. A thin jet of muddy water shot through the middle, widening instantly into a torrent. Within moments, the entire section began to crumble. In Johnstown, just before 1 p.m., the rain seemed to ease slightly. People stepped out onto their porches, looking at the rivers, which had spread across the lower streets. Some smiled with relief, thinking the storm was passing. Children floated sticks in the floodwater. A group of men gathered at the telegraph office, chatting about whether the trains would run that day. Above them, at that very moment, 20 million tons of water were straining against a dam that was seconds from giving way. Back at the lake, Unger turned and walked away from the crest. There was nothing left to do. The ground shook once a deep, muffled crack that rolled across the valley. Then came silence, just for a breath. At 3:10 the afternoon, the South Fork Dam burst. At 3:10 p.m., on May 31st, 1889, the South Fork Dam gave way. It didn't explode all at once. It started with a single break near the center, a brown gap, no wider than a wagon. Water burst through it with the sound of tearing fabric. Then, in seconds, the gap widened. The entire middle section of the dam dissolved, as if swallowed from within. Earth, stone, timber, all torn away by the pressure of 20 million tons of water finally finding release. Witnesses on the hillside saw it happen. They described the sound as unlike anything they had ever heard. Not thunder, not gunfire, but something deeper, continuous, almost alive. One man later said, it felt as though the mountains themselves had split open. The first wave leapt forward, rising higher than the trees. It was a solid wall of water and debris, 40 feet high, moving faster than a train. For a brief moment, the floor of the lake was exposed mud, fish, broken timbers, the carcass of a horse that had drowned days earlier. Then the entire lake followed, rushing down the narrow valley toward Johnstown. The water gathered everything in its path. Forests snapped like matchsticks. Boulders rolled, houses splintered. Each mile down the valley added new weight, new speed, new destruction. The wave was not clean. It was thick, black, full of trees, livestock, fences, and fragments of the dam itself. Observers said it looked more like moving earth than water. The small village of South Fork was the first to be hit. Residents saw the wall of water coming and had only seconds to react. Some ran uphill, others froze, unable to believe what they were seeing. A few managed to reach higher ground, most did not. Within minutes, the town was gone, carried away, houses and people alike, leaving only a churn of debris behind. The torrent then slammed into Mineral Point, a mile below. It tore through the railroad yards, tossing train cars into the air like toys. Telegraph poles vanished. The telegraph operator who had tried to warn Johnstown stayed at his post, tapping until the wires went dead. No one heard his last message. As the wave thundered down the valley, it began to change shape. Where the valley narrowed, it grew taller, faster, more violent. Where it widened, it spread and slowed, leaving behind heaps of shattered timber and twisted metal. Each village it met added to the chaos. More houses, more people, more wreckage swept into the main current. At the Pennsylvania Railroad Bridge near East Conemaugh, a stationary freight train stood waiting. The engineer saw the water coming and blew the whistle in warning. A few workers ran uphill. Moments later, the flood hit the train, lifting locomotives off the tracks and throwing them into the torrent. The whistle was still sounding when it disappeared beneath the water. In less than an hour, the wave traveled 14 miles. It moved with the unstoppable precision of physics, mass, gravity, and slope. It carried barns, trees, cattle, whole sections of hillside. Some of the debris was sharp enough to cut telegraph wires miles ahead, sending flashes of sparks into the rain. By the time the flood reached the outskirts of Johnstown, it had grown into something monstrous, a rolling black front of water, mud, and wreckage, 40 feet high and nearly half a mile wide. The noise was deafening. One survivor said it sounded like 1,000 freight trains, and all of them screaming. Down in the town, no one could see the wave coming. The valley curved, and heavy rain veiled the upper reaches of the river. People heard only a distant roar, a sound they couldn't place. Some thought it was thunder. Others said it was the mills. By the time they realized it was neither, it was too late. The dam was gone. The lake was gone. And what had been water, quiet and still that morning, was now a moving mountain bearing down on 20,000 unsuspecting people. The wave reached Johnstown just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. For most of the day, the town had been half flooded already. The rivers had merged into one wide, brown current running through the center of town. People were standing in doorways, watching barrels and furniture drift past, joking about the weather. Then the sound changed. It began as a low, rolling rumble, growing louder until windows trembled in their frames. Horses reared in panic. Men stopped talking and turned toward the upstream end of the valley. Over the rooftops, through the rain, came a black wall higher than the telegraph poles, moving too fast to understand. For an instant, everything went still. Then, the world broke apart. The first impact tore through the western edge of town. Entire blocks disappeared in seconds. The water wasn't clear. It was thick with mud, trees, houses, wagons, animals, a moving mass of destruction. Timbers snapped like gunfire. Roofs sheared away. A church bell rang once and then vanished beneath the current. Those who were outside had no chance. The force of the water was unimaginable. Trains thrown from their tracks, iron girders bent like wire. People clung to floating debris, screaming for loved ones who were already gone. Within minutes, the center of Johnstown was unrecognizable, a churning sea of wreckage, spinning in circles as the flood collided with the stone walls of the mills. At the edge of town, The great bridge of the Pennsylvania Railroad became a trap. The massive stone structure caught the wreckage houses, trees, animals, and held it fast. The floodwaters piled against it, twisting into a whirlpool. Then the debris caught fire. Witnesses said the blaze burned for hours, lighting the valley even after the sun had set. No one ever knew how many people were trapped in that pile when it ignited. Upstream, the destruction continued mile after mile. Villages vanished. Bridges were torn from their foundations. Telegraph lines fell. The flood carried pieces of everything: furniture, livestock, machinery, even the contents of people's homes, mixing them into one dark, shifting mass. At every bend, the valley funneled the water higher, faster, more violent. In the midst of it all, small pockets of survival appeared. Some people found themselves on rooftops still intact, drifting with the current. A few reached trees or the upper floors of brick buildings that managed to hold. Others rode the flood itself on doors, beams, even dead horses swept miles through the chaos. They described hearing nothing but the roar of water and the cracking of wood, a sound so loud it erased all thought. Then, as suddenly as it began, the wave passed. It didn't stop, it simply kept moving east, spilling its energy across the valley until there was nothing left to destroy. In its wake came silence, the kind of silence that follows only after everything familiar has been taken away. The rain still fell, but softly now, tapping on what was left of the rooftops. The air smelled of mud, oil, and smoke. By evening, the valley was still. The water had settled into dark pools between mounds of wreckage. People who had survived clung to each other in disbelief. The noise, the movement, the entire rush of it gone in less than 10 minutes. In that short span, the city of Johnstown, a century in the making, had been wiped from the map. Above the valley, the rain began to ease. The broken remains of the dam stood like jagged teeth against the fading sky. The lake was gone. The hills were scarred with deep cuts where the water had scoured the earth bare. The caretakers looked down into the void they had created, a dry basin where fish flopped helplessly in the mud. Below them, the valley lay in darkness. The flood that day would move 23 miles from the reservoir to the river's mouth. It would kill more than 2,000 people. And yet, in its passing, it lasted less than an hour. Everything that mattered happened between 3:10 and 4:10 p.m. An entire town destroyed in the time it takes to finish a meal. The sound of the water faded into the distance, swallowed by the hills. Night came quietly, as it always did, though nothing in the valley below would ever be the same again. When the wave reached the heart of Johnstown, it struck with the force of a weapon. Entire neighborhoods vanished in seconds. Brick buildings crumbled as if they were made of paper. The Cambria iron works, the pride of the valley, was torn apart. Its massive furnaces, once roaring with fire, were drowned and silenced. The water hit from the west and kept moving east, sweeping everything before it. People who tried to run found the streets already gone. Some were crushed beneath collapsing buildings. Others were carried off without a sound. A few who managed to reach the upper floors of stronger structures watched the destruction unfold from their windows, powerless to do anything but pray. At the railroad bridge on the edge of town, the torrent reached its limit. The bridge's heavy stone arches stood firm, catching the full weight of the debris. Houses, wagons, trees, even train cars piled against it, forming a dam of wreckage nearly 30 feet high. Behind it, the trapped water churned, turning the center of Johnstown into a vast, swirling pool. Then, somehow, it caught fire. No one knew exactly how. Perhaps a burst oil tank, perhaps a stove carried by the current. The flames spread quickly, fed by the wood and oil soaked into the debris. Soon the entire mass at the bridge was burning, a towering inferno floating on the flood. Witnesses miles away said they could see the glow against the clouds. For hours, the fire burned while the rain still fell. Survivors clinging to rooftops or trapped in pockets of wreckage watched helplessly as the flames consumed what remained of their homes and neighbors. Some could hear cries coming from within the burning pile, voices that faded one by one as the fire spread. It was a scene of chaos and stillness all at once, light and smoke moving over water that no longer moved at all. Elsewhere in the valley, the flood was already receding, leaving behind a wasteland. Where streets had been, there were tangled heaps of timber and twisted rails. Piles of mud reached the rooftops. In some places, the debris was so deep that rescuers later walked across what had once been second floors. The smell of oil, ash, and wet earth hung heavy in the air. The sound of the mills was gone. Even the rain seemed quieter now. As night fell, the surviving townspeople began to emerge, dazed, shivering, silent. They carried lanterns, searching for family, for neighbors, for anything familiar. Many wandered without direction, calling names into the dark. The echoes came back without answer. Others gathered on the higher ground, staring down at what had been their city. Fires still burned at the bridge, reflecting off the water like the last light of a dying world. In those first hours after the flood, there was no plan, no order. People helped where they could, dragging the injured from the water, covering the dead with blankets and boards. A few found shelter in the remaining churches, lighting candles in silence. The storm clouds began to break, revealing a faint evening sky, a pale, indifferent light over a landscape that no longer resembled a town. By midnight, the fires had begun to die. Smoke drifted over the valley in thin ribbons, mixing with fog. The water level dropped slowly, revealing the scale of what had happened. Entire families were gone. Whole streets had vanished as if erased from the map. Only the church steeples and a handful of brick buildings remained standing, silent witnesses to the disaster. The rain stopped some time before dawn. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. No trains, no mills, no laughter. Only the slow drip of water from broken eaves, the creak of timber shifting under its own weight, and the faint hiss of steam rising from the bridge. When morning came, the sun revealed everything that the night had hidden. Johnstown was gone, not ruined, not damaged, but erased. A valley once filled with life was now a graveyard of mud, wood, and silence. The sun rose over Johnstown on June 1st, 1889. It shone on silence. The same hills that had watched the valley fill with smoke and water the day before now stood calm under a pale, washed-out sky. The rain had finally stopped. Mist clung to the ruins, softening the edges of a city that no longer existed. In the early light, survivors began to move through what was left of the streets. They did not speak much. The sound of boots in the mud replaced the noise of the mills and trains. People looked for landmarks and found none. Where there had been blocks of houses, there were piles of splintered wood, heaps of furniture, tangled rails, and the bodies of animals and people alike. A faint smell of oil and decay hung in the air. Pools of dark water reflected broken chimneys and the burnt wreckage of the railroad bridge. The fire that had burned through the night was still smoldering, thin smoke rising from the mound of debris that had trapped so many. Steam hissed from the warm ruins as the sun touched them for the first time. Some of the survivors had spent the night on rooftops or in trees, waiting for help that never came. They climbed down slowly, numb from cold and shock. Many were barefoot, their clothes torn. They moved like ghosts among the ruins, not crying, not calling out, just walking. As morning went on, people began to search for the missing. Mothers walked to the wreckage, calling the names of children who would never answer. Men used planks and poles to turn over debris, hoping for movement, for a sound. Here and there they found survivors, a woman trapped between beams, a child in a barrel, a man clinging to a beam miles from where his house had stood. Each rescue was a small miracle, met not with cheers, but with quiet disbelief. By midday, help began to arrive from nearby towns. Farmers, miners, and railroad men came on foot, following the river's path of destruction. They found a landscape they could barely comprehend. Miles of track were gone. The valley floor was buried under layers of mud and broken timber. The smell of death and oil filled the air. They built makeshift rafts and bridges from the debris, trying to reach pockets of survivors still stranded by water. News of the disaster spread quickly. Telegraph lines were down, but riders carried the story east and west. By afternoon, newspapers in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia were already printing the first reports. Johnstown destroyed, thousands dead. The word seemed unreal, even to those who had seen it. The first organized relief came that evening. Doctors, railroad workers, and volunteers carrying blankets and food. They built temporary shelters from the ruins, laying boards across the mud to form walkways. Some survivors were too shocked to move, sitting where they had been found, staring into the distance. One journalist described the scene as a city of statues made of mud. That night, as darkness returned, lanterns flickered across the valley like scattered stars. Rescue teams worked by hand, digging with shovels, axes, anything they could find. The cries of the wounded had faded. What remained was the slow, methodical sound of shovels striking wood. Every few minutes, someone would call for silence, listening for a voice beneath the rubble. Most times, there was none. The storm was over, but the rain had left its mark on everything. Mud clung to every surface. The air was heavy, still, almost solid. Somewhere beyond the hills, the rivers continued to flow, carrying fragments of the town toward the Ohio. In the valley, the survivors gathered near fires built from broken furniture and railroad ties. They spoke quietly of the missing, of what they had seen, of what could never be rebuilt. When dawn came again, it was clear that Johnstown was not just damaged, it was gone. In less than a day, 20,000 lives had been stripped of their homes, and 2,000 souls had vanished beneath the flood. The water had retreated, but the memory of it would remain, carved into the valley and into everyone who survived. In the days that followed the flood, Johnstown became a landscape of work. There were no machines, no organized commands, only people with shovels, ropes, and their bare hands. The first survivors who could still move began to dig. They pulled at beams, overturned carts, and built small fires along the riverbanks to keep warm. There was no plan, just instinct: find the living, bury the dead. Rescue parties formed out of whatever men and women remained. Blacksmiths, miners, mill workers, people used to hard labor now worked in silence through mud that reached their knees. The smell was unbearable. Rotting timber, oil, and decay mixed in the warm air. The river, still swollen, carried debris downstream. Barrels, furniture, pieces of clothing, fragments of houses. At night, lanterns burned across the valley like floating embers. Word of the disaster spread beyond Pennsylvania. By June 2nd, trains loaded with supplies began arriving from Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, and Philadelphia. Carts brought bread, blankets, medicine. Reporters came, two describing scenes of devastation so vast they struggled to put them into words. One wrote, "The town has ceased to exist. What remains is a plain of mud and death." Amid the chaos, people worked quietly, side by side. Strangers lifted beams together, carried wounded to makeshift shelters, built stretchers from doors and fence posts. Women formed kitchens along the dry parts of town, boiling coffee over campfires, feeding anyone who came. Priests moved through the ruins, offering prayers, their words half drowned by the sound of axes splitting wood. The dead were everywhere. Entire families were found still together, trapped in what had been their homes. The survivors began to build long rows of coffins from whatever lumber they could salvage. Bodies were laid out in lines for identification. The smell of death became part of the valley air, inescapable, heavy, and constant. Men removed their hats as they passed the rows, not from ceremony, but from habit, because silence was all they had left to offer. On June 5th, the first organized relief effort arrived. It was led by Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross. She was 68 years old. Her team set up tents on the edge of the ruins, distributing food, clothing, and medicine. It was the first major disaster response in Red Cross history, the beginning of a new kind of humanitarian work in America. Barton and her volunteers worked for months. They built shelters, hospitals, kitchens, and warehouses from salvaged wood. They listened to the survivors' stories and recorded names of the missing. Her calm leadership and the quiet order she brought to the chaos became a kind of relief itself. For many, it was the first sign that the nightmare could end. The railroads played their part too. Engineers repaired tracks across the valley, laying rails over mud and wreckage to bring in more supplies. Telegraph lines were restored, connecting Johnstown to the outside world again. By the end of the first week, hundreds of volunteers had arrived. Doctors, soldiers, carpenters, clergy, each doing what they could. No one asked for payment. Everyone worked. In the evenings, the fires of the relief camps glowed along the valley floor. The sound of hammering echoed again, not for steel, but for rebuilding homes and coffins alike. The people who had lost everything began to reclaim small pieces of their lives: a chair, a photo, a ring found in the mud. They spoke little, but when they did, it was with the steady tone of people who had accepted what had happened and still chose to go on. By the second week, the mud had begun to dry. Paths formed through the wreckage, and the first new shelters took shape. Johnstown was no longer silent. The valley was still scarred, but it was alive with the sound of tools, voices, and the slow return of order. What had begun as chaos was becoming a kind of determination, a belief that even from this, something could be rebuilt. When the floodwaters receded, questions began to rise. How could this happen? Who had built the dam? Who had let it decay? And who, if anyone, would be held accountable for more than 2,000 deaths? In the weeks after the disaster, officials arrived from Harrisburg and Pittsburgh to investigate. They walked through the ruins with notebooks and measuring tapes, studying the remains of the South Fork Dam. What they found was both obvious and horrifying. The dam had been badly designed, poorly repaired, and never inspected. Its spillway was blocked, its drainage pipes sealed, its crest lowered. It was a structure waiting to fail, and yet no law had been broken, because there were no laws to break. Engineers drew diagrams of the broken dam, noting the depth of erosion, the pattern of collapse, the angle of the breach. It took them only days to conclude that the disaster had not been an act of nature. It was an act of neglect. An artificial lake, built for convenience and leisure, had destroyed an industrial city, but naming the cause was easier than assigning blame. The owners of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club were among the most powerful men in America. Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, their names carried weight far beyond Pennsylvania. The newspapers mentioned them cautiously, if at all. The club had no legal charter, no clear chain of command. It existed on paper as a private association, and the law, as written, offered no means to hold its members responsible. Still, the public demanded answers. Editorials called the dam a monument to arrogance. Cartoonists drew images of wealthy men fishing while the valley drowned below. Letters poured into the state capitol demanding justice. But in the courtrooms, the process moved slowly, deliberately, and predictably. Survivors filed hundreds of lawsuits against the club and its members. Each case argued that negligence had led to the flood. The club's lawyers countered with a single powerful defense: act of God. They claimed the rainfall had been unprecedented, the failure unforeseeable. No human, they said, could be blamed for the will of nature. The courts agreed. Not one member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was ever found legally liable. No fines were paid. No prison sentences were served. The survivors received nothing. Newspapers reported the verdicts with a kind of weary resignation. Justice drowned with Johnstown, one editorial read. For the people who had lost everything, the outcome was not a surprise, just another loss to bear. They had seen too much to expect fairness from the same men who had built fortunes on the valley's labor. The investigations did, however, change something deeper. Engineers began to question the safety of private dams across the United States. Reports from Johnstown were studied in universities and technical societies. The flood became a warning not just about water, but about power, wealth, and responsibility. It was the beginning of a slow shift toward regulation, safety standards, and professional accountability in American engineering. For the survivors, though, those reforms came too late. They still lived among the ruins, rebuilding their homes plank by plank. The Red Cross camps remained for months, then years. Families moved into small houses built from donated materials. By the end of 1889, Johnstown was rising again, smaller, quieter, scarred, but alive. The dam was never rebuilt. The lake was drained, the valley above reclaimed by forest. Only fragments of stone remained, scattered across the hillside, slowly disappearing under moss and grass. The men who had owned the club returned to their cities, their businesses, and their wealth. They never spoke publicly about the flood. In Johnstown, the people didn't speak of it much either. For a long time, the disaster became something private, a wound too deep to reopen. The survivors had learned what kind of silence follows when the world looks away. By the end of the summer of 1889, the valley had changed again. Where there had been a wasteland of mud and wreckage, there were now streets being cleared, walls being raised, smoke curling once more from chimneys. Johnstown was rebuilding slowly, painfully, but unmistakably. The work began with what could be saved. Steel beams from the ruined mills were pulled from the mud, cleaned and reused. Bricks were gathered from collapsed buildings and stacked in neat rows for future walls. Every plank of wood that wasn't burned or rotted found new purpose. The town that had been destroyed by water was rising from its own remains. Much of this order came from the Red Cross. Clara Barton and her volunteers remained in Johnstown for more than 5 months, the longest relief mission the organization had ever undertaken. They built over 1,000 small houses known as Red Cross cottages. Each one was simple: one room, wooden walls, a stove, a door that closed. But to the families who moved in, it meant safety. For the first time since the flood, They could sleep without fear. As the temporary shelters multiplied, so did the sound of rebuilding. Hammers, saws, and voices filled the air again. Men worked on rail lines and bridges. Women repaired clothing, cooked for the workers, tended to children. The valley, which had seemed dead in June, began to move again in August. Trains returned first cautiously at first, crawling across newly laid rails over ground that still smelled of mud. The first whistle heard after the flood brought people out into the streets. They stopped and listened, many with tears in their eyes. The sound was more than a signal of commerce. It was proof that the outside world had not forgotten them. New businesses began to open in makeshift tents and shacks. Barbers, bakers, and blacksmiths returned to work, often in the same locations where their shops had stood before. There was no time for ceremony. People worked because they had to, because life, even after such destruction, refused to stop. By autumn, schools reopened in temporary buildings. Churches held services under canvas roofs. The survivors gathered every Sunday, not just to pray, but to see one another, to confirm that the community still existed. When the church bells rang again, their sound carried through the valley like an echo of what had been lost and was being found again. The Red Cross gradually handed its duties back to local committees. Their final act was to organize the cemetery to mark the graves, identify the dead, and give each a number and a name when possible. The last unidentified victims were laid to rest in a section called the Plot of the Unknown. Even in rebuilding, the memory of loss was everywhere. Winter came early that year. Snow fell on the valley before all the new houses were finished. Families gathered around iron stoves, wrapped in donated blankets, listening to the wind against the thin wooden walls. Outside, the frozen river was quiet, its surface hiding the scars beneath. It would thaw again in spring, as it always had, and the people of Johnstown would still be there. By the time the first anniversary arrived, the town looked alive once more. The factories had reopened. Trains came and went. Children played in the streets. From a distance, it might have seemed as though the flood had never happened. But everyone who lived there knew better. They carried its memory in the way they looked at the sky when it rained, in the way they measured water against the bridge pilings, and in the way they built their homes just a little higher than before. Rebuilding Johnstown was more than reconstruction, it was defiance. It was a statement that even in a place where everything had been taken, people could begin again. Not through speeches or monuments, but through work. Quiet, steady, unending work. The Johnstown flood was more than a disaster. It was a turning point. When the waters receded and the ruins dried, what remained was not just a valley of grief, but a question that America had never truly faced. What happens when progress outpaces responsibility? In the 1,880 seconds, the United States was still learning how to balance power with caution. Industry was booming, railroads expanding, fortunes multiplying. Men believed that if something could be built, it should be built, and that nature could always be mastered. The South Fork Dam was one small expression of that confidence. Its collapse exposed the cost of that belief. In the months after the flood, engineers, lawmakers, and journalists debated what it meant. Newspapers called it the price of modern ambition. Technical journals analyzed the dam's design, its failures, and the lack of oversight. For the first time, professionals began to speak publicly about engineering ethics, about duty, accountability, and the human lives behind every blueprint. From that point forward, the idea of safety codes and inspections gained momentum. States began drafting laws to regulate private dams and industrial projects. The movement was slow, uneven, often resisted by the same interests that had built the old world. But the memory of Johnstown lingered, an unspoken warning behind every new structure that promised to control nature. Insurance companies changed too. They began to study risk differently, not just as chance, but as consequence. When they looked at the photographs of Johnstown, they saw numbers: cost, liability, exposure. Behind those numbers, though, lay the same truth that the survivors already knew: that human decisions, not natural forces, had created the disaster. For the Red Cross, Johnstown was a proving ground. Clara Barton's mission established the organization as a permanent force in American life. From then on, the Red Cross became the face of organized compassion, ready to move wherever disaster struck, bringing not just relief, but order and dignity. Her quiet leadership in the valley became a model for modern humanitarian response. Culturally, the flood left a mark that went beyond policy. It became a story retold in newspapers, sermons, and eventually in classrooms. For decades, it symbolized both tragedy and endurance. The name Johnstown came to mean more than a place. It meant the idea that human ambition, left unchecked, could destroy itself. It was a lesson written not in words, but in water and loss. In time, the survivors built monuments: a small stone marker at the site of the old dam, a memorial cemetery in the valley, and plaques where streets once stood. They were modest, quiet reminders rather than grand gestures. The people who rebuilt Johnstown were not interested in glory. They wanted memory, not spectacle. By the early 20th century, Johnstown had recovered economically. The mills ran again, and new generations grew up unaware of how completely the valley had once been erased. Yet every few decades, when the rivers rose and the rain fell hard, people remembered. In 1936, in 1977, and again later, floods returned, smaller, but never forgotten. Each time, the town survived, stronger, more cautious, a living testament to what had once happened there. The legacy of the Johnstown flood is not found in its ruins, but in its influence. It reshaped American ideas of responsibility in engineering, in law, in community. It taught that progress without foresight is not progress at all, and that technology, without ethics, can turn against its makers. More than a century later, the scars of that day are still visible in the landscape, not as wounds, but as reminders. The valley stands quiet again, the rivers flowing through green hills as they did before. But beneath the calm surface, in the soil and in memory, lies the story of a lesson written once, clearly, in the language of water. Today, the valley of Johnstown is green again. The rivers flow quietly between the hills, winding past bridges and neighborhoods rebuilt long ago. If you walk the same ground where the flood once raged, you would never know what happened here, not from the sound, not from the air. The water moves gently now, shallow and clear, whispering against the stones. The site of the old South Fork Dam still exists. Grass covers its remains. A trail runs along the ridge where the carriage path once crossed. Visitors walk there in silence, looking down at the empty basin that was once Lake Conemaugh. In spring, wildflowers bloom where the lake once lay, bright patches of color over soil that once carried 20 million tons of water. There is a small museum near the dam, now a few rooms filled with photographs, fragments of wood, and the personal belongings found in the mud: a child's shoe, a pocket watch, a torn letter. Each object is ordinary, but together they hold the weight of a vanished world. They remind visitors that history is not just written in books, it lingers in what people leave behind. In Johnstown itself, life goes on. The mills are mostly gone, replaced by quiet streets and small businesses. New houses line the hillsides where the water never reached. On rainy days, the rivers still rise, but the people watch calmly now. Flood walls and warning systems stand where fear once did. Every few years, the town holds a commemoration, not a celebration, but an acknowledgement. They read the names of the lost, sound the sirens once, and let silence follow. For those who visit, it can be hard to imagine the force that once tore this valley apart. The hills seem too peaceful, the water too small, but the land remembers, even if it doesn't show it. The earth beneath the grass is layered with fragments, brick dust, iron, glass, the residue of that single day in 1889. Beneath every footstep lies a trace of what the valley endured and overcame. Nature has reclaimed what it lost. The rivers have carved new paths. Trees have grown where fire once burned. And yet, standing there, it's easy to feel a quiet weight. Not sorrow, exactly, but respect. The kind that comes when time has passed and the noise of the world has faded, leaving only the outline of what happened. If you listen carefully on a calm afternoon, you can hear the wind moving through the trees above the old dam. It sounds like water, soft and distant, echoing through the hills. The same sound the people of Johnstown once heard, not knowing what it meant. Now it means something else, not danger, not fear, but memory. The Johnstown flood is more than a tragedy in the past. It is a reminder written into the rhythm of the land itself that progress is fragile, that safety is never permanent, and that human strength lies not in control, but in resilience. The valley sleeps peacefully again. The rivers move on, carrying with them the story of what happened here, a story of water, of failure, and of people who refused to disappear. And as the day ends and the light fades behind the hills, Johnstown rests beneath a quiet sky, alive, rebuilt, and forever remembering.